Welcome to the Highland Heights Sunday morning Bible class. We're glad to be back together for another discussion. If you haven't been with us, we are going through a series on apologetics, each week taking a different issue and looking at what are some of the arguments or answers that Christians have when specific challenges to the faith come up. While we don't always spend time studying apologetics, it's really quite necessary for a strong development of the faith. And we hope that this Bible class over the next few weeks will be something that kind of motivates us to continue studying in this way. And as we said, Jeremy, a few times throughout the past few weeks, the purpose of our class is not necessarily to instill in you all of the answers that you will need, but to remind you that we are not the first people to think about this, and that there are answers out there, and there's always resources to go to for when these challenges come up, or we're having conversations with friends and family members about these issues. So with that, we are in week 4, so feel free to go back and watch some of the past few weeks on YouTube. Today, we are going to be dealing with evolution, the study of what are the origins of the species, as Darwin put it. Where did we come from? And so this is a hotly contested issue, not just from Scope's monkey, but something that is going on in classrooms today. And before I throw it over to Jeremy, I have to give a disclaimer about the two people who are having this conversation today. Both of us grew up going to Christian schools, and I wouldn't change that for anything, not only for K-12, but also college, higher ed at that. And ironically, neither of us have ever been taught evolution by someone who actually believed in evolution. But we are widely read people, so we've done our research on what the other side believes, we hope. So with that, Jeremy, I've taken away all of our credibility.
Yeah, really.
What are the basic arguments on the other side? What do we need to be thinking about? What's our definitions here?
Well, definitions is a good place to start, because what we're dealing with is, just for the sake of clarity, evolution is a fairly broad term. It does evolution in a general sense occur? Okay, first curveball. Yes, it does. But there are different kinds of evolution. Okay, so don't turn off yet. Yeah, okay, hold on, back it up just a second. Okay. There are two terms, micro and macroevolution. Okay. Microevolution generally refers to just change within a species. Okay. I'm indebted to Brian Lawson, by the way, for a couple of definitions. Brian teaches AP biology. Okay. So that's set by, those requirements are set by the College Board. So there are things that they are required to teach for the curriculum. So from the AP biology textbook that we use at school, he sent me a couple of definitions. One is species, a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed and produce viable, that word viable is in caps, it's important, to produce viable offspring. So offspring that can survive, offspring that can continue to produce. So microevolution is, generally speaking, just adaptation within a species. Okay. Think, Darwin's finches. You get the food that's deeper in the ground, and so finches that have longer beaks are able to get to the food easier, and so those are the finches that live, and so they pass on the longer beak genes, whatever. They pass those on. Okay. And that sort of adaptation, it happens. We see it all the time, okay? Dog breeding is a form of this. As we breed for, and by the way, we breed, keep that thought in mind, we breed for certain characteristics within dogs. Now, another level, macroevolution, or Darwinian macroevolution, if you prefer, again, coming from Brian's definitions, a broad pattern of evolution above the species level. Okay, so at the genus, order, family level, you go farther up the taxonomic scale, you're getting bigger groups of animals, and you're getting evolution within those groups that is leading to the creation of new species. Okay. So Darwinian macroevolution, what we're talking about is the idea that all life derives from a common ancestor. Okay. So your umpteen millionth cousin is the tree in your front yard. Okay. That all life, and that the different forms of life that we see come from small, subtle variations, adaptations within different populations as they become more adept and more apt at survival. Then they pass those traits on, and that this adaptation creates new biological systems within the body, within the organism. And so over time, many billions upon billions of years, there are scientists out there that say life on Earth first began 3.5 billion years ago. So long time. We're dealing with long periods of time here. That over time, you had two organisms that are the same organism, but they adapt in different ways. And so it diverges, and one becomes a dog and one becomes a cat, or something like that. Or their descendants become dogs and cats. Okay. So that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about adaptation within species. That happens. In a sense, what we're doing is people have taken that adaptation within species and they have said, oh, well, this must occur at a higher level, and so all life is descended from a common ancestor.
So, the common ancestor, going back to the first sign of life that was on Earth 3.5 billion years ago, as the evolutionists would say, and all of the descendants from that. So one place where we don't want to caricature the evolutionist side is that we wouldn't say that that people and all species are descended from like that everything is within our lineage, that every single animal that's ever existed is within our lineage. So if you can imagine a tree going up with many branches, we would have a common ancestor. As you said, the tree is my cousin, but it's not necessarily a direct descendant of what's
right.
Once again, according to evolutionary theory.
Or ancestor. It's often said that humans are descended from monkeys. No, we are not descended from monkeys.
We have common ancestors.
We have a common ancestor with monkeys. We're hairless, highly intelligent apes.
Well, tell that to Coco. So, right. So closely related. Okay. So that's the general argument that's going on here. So the microevolution is something that can be seen, and even creationist scientists would agree that it is observed within even a few short generations. Thus says the two bald guys who are talking to you that, apparently we haven't been bred out yet. So we have the reality of some sort of evolution. We would say microevolution, but macroevolution is on the other side. So why does this theory, why does this scientific explanation need to exist? What's going on here to where this is needed? I'm not sure how much Darwin we want to get into, or what's the purpose of macroevolution for explaining these things?
Well, I don't know that I would call it necessarily purpose. Darwin saw something that he found interesting going on, this adaptation, and he theorized that, hey, this could be an explanation for life. Now, there are those that say, oh, well, evolution does not rule out God. Macroevolution doesn't rule out God. And I would agree that that's true. However, as Darwin said, and one of the important things in Darwinian macroevolution is it is unguided. Okay. It specifically says that they are random adaptations, random mutations, if you will. They are unguided. There is no guiding hand. Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, natural selection led to that. Okay, what's going on when they say natural selection led to that is, okay, if you've got two different animals living in the Arctic, one has no fur, the other has lots of fur. The one with lots of fur is going to survive longer and be more likely to pass on its furry genes than the hairless one because it's cold. Okay. And so that's natural selection. It's more of it's a duh kind of a thing. It's a logical thing. Of course, the animal with fur would survive. It's less likely to freeze to death than the hairless one. Okay. So that's what we're talking about when we mean natural selection. So people say that, oh, well, macroevolution does not rule God out. Again, it doesn't. However, it does provide an alternative explanation for, well, it provides an alternative explanation for the diversity of life. An evolutionist might say that it provides an alternative solution for, or alternative explanation for the origins of life. As we'll hopefully we'll come back to, that is one of the problems that we run into when we consider evolution, is the question of origins. Because spoiler alert, it doesn't necessarily provide for that. But the evolutionists might say it provides an alternative explanation. And Darwin himself said that you've removed God from the equation when you have this theory. We mentioned a few weeks ago Lee Strobel's book. Lee Strobel was an atheist, and the story of his journey to faith is a fascinating story in a number of ways. But one of the things in one of his books, A Case for a Creator, he talks about how when he was taught evolution as a high schooler, I think a freshman or sophomore in high school, he said, well, then what? God's out of a job. Okay. And the way the question is phrased in The Case for Faith is evolution explains life, so God isn't needed. Well, I mean, there's a fundamental problem with that, which is it makes God into an instrument. God is the way that Christianity solves the problem of where did life come from. That is not what we think about God. God is much more than an instrument for, quote unquote, solving this problem. Mm-hmm. So it reduces God to an instrument. It presumes a God of the gaps, which is not what we are arguing at all. We do not argue a God that we use to fill in the gaps of our knowledge. God of the gaps.
Give a bit more of a description of what you mean by God of the gaps.
Okay. God of the gaps is an idea that, okay, I have a hole in something I cannot explain. Okay. I can't explain where life comes from, so God, boom. I can't explain how
the rain comes.
How the rain comes, so God. Okay. I can't explain how that person got well from this terrible disease, so God, boom. Okay. We would not, that's not what we're arguing. We're not arguing for a God of the gaps. We should not argue for a God of the gaps. Again, if God exists and God is truth, we have nothing to fear from studying the natural world because God made the natural world. And the deeper we plumb into the natural world, the more God will be revealed through the order and the natural wonder that exists. Okay. So the way the question is phrased that, well, evolution explains God, so you don't need God. Well, we don't use God to explain life. And so you have to consider when you're talking about the case for God, the entire case for God, rather than just this one thing. Okay. So the real question before us is, does Darwinian macroevolution answer the facts? Which are, the question at hand is, what is the origin of life and how did we get such variation of life? Does Darwinian macroevolution answer that question in accord with the evidence or not?
Okay, so getting into these ideas of evidence. So one of the difficult parts here for people who are trying to let's say that you're impartial here. You don't really know either side, and you were questioning both sides, trying to get from them evidence. One of the burdens here is that the creationists, those that believe that God created the world, believe that we have the knowledge that we need because we have revelation from God. What we see in the natural world fits into the revelation that we're able to see. And from the creationist scientists that I'm aware of, they do a pretty good job of saying, okay, so this can be explained by this can be explained by this. With the evolutionists, on the other hand, they will often respond with, oh, well, that's a God of the gaps. You're explaining this, and we just haven't found the thing that will prove our side. If there's this, you might have heard before the missing link. So supposedly in the fossil evidence, well, obviously we have humans, but then we'll find some skull of what looks like and this is where a Homo erectus, like the first person to get off of four legs and to get up on two. And we say, okay, well, we found this skeleton that really looks like it must have been walking along on four and maybe just on its knuckles. And we would expect to find fossil evidence, some type of evidence in the ground that verifies that, well, there was something that happened in between this millions year old fossil and what we have today. And so the creationists will often say, we haven't found it, therefore it can't exist. And so the evolutionists will say, well, you can't argue, it's a black swan argument. Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. However, I'll hand it off here. That's not the entirety of the evidence that we would be searching for. So, Jeremy.
No, you're right. And it's interesting because the evolutionists would accuse us of, well, you're arguing on the basis of, you can't argue on the basis of because we haven't found it, it doesn't exist. Okay, that's true. You also can't argue on the basis of we haven't found it, therefore it does exist. The problem is, and by the way, Darwin assumed back in 1867, 69, somewhere in that area is when he published On the Origin of Species. Darwin presumed that the fossil record would eventually bear him out, that we would find the progression of transitory forms, where you're moving from a dinosaur, from a Tyrannosaurus Rex to a chicken. Okay, and that is, the current theory is that birds are actually descended from dinosaurs. Okay, so you're moving from T-Rex to your meal at Chick-fil-A. All right, and we would find those intervening forms. The problem is we have found millions more fossils, or thousands more fossils. Okay, I'm not sure the exact number, but a lot more fossils. The fossil record is significantly more in depth than it was. We haven't found any of those transitionary forms. None. Okay. The ones that do appear to be like transitionary forms, like there's a fossil of a feathered dinosaur called an Archaeopteryx. Okay, and it was pointed out as the missing link. Here's the missing link between dinosaurs and birds, and it turned out that that's a dead end. It's a cul-de-sac. It doesn't go anywhere. Even more problematic though is, okay, evolution assumes that the changes will be constant over time. It's the kind of thing, well, it's like watching your kids grow up. You don't see the growth from day to day, but they start kindergarten and you look back and go, wait a minute, you were just like 2, you were just running around the church classroom with your best friend, and now you're off to kindergarten with your best friend and you're both like a foot taller, and what happened? Okay. And so the idea is that that's how Darwinian macroevolution would work, is it happens slowly over time. The problem again is that the fossil record does not bear that out. There's a term in these studies called the Cambrian Explosion, okay, which you go from the Precambrian era to the Cambrian era of geology, and you've got just a few fossils around in the Precambrian era, and then boom, you've got like every body form, everything in the Cambrian era in what is a geologically very short, we would consider it a long frame of time because we only live about 80 to 100 years. it's a very short time geologically. And that ain't how the theory is supposed to work. So it's not just that the evidence has not been found yet. It's as we dig deeper. Okay, imagine you've got a crime that's been committed, okay, a robbery or something, and you think you've got your guy. So you're going to pull your Angela Lansbury out, and, well, I guess she didn't do
There were so many people that died in that small town.
Exactly. It's amazing. I would move. But anyway, and, you know, we talked about robbery because let's not make this any more morbid than it has to be. So you're going to put your Angela Lansbury hat on and you're going to go solve this robbery. And you've got the guy you think it is. And at the beginning of the case, you're like, okay, I suspect that guy. And so I'm going to go look for the evidence. And then it's not that you just never find the evidence. It's that the more evidence you find, the less likely it looks that your suspect is guilty. And that's kind of what we've got going on. So the first real challenge or question with macroevolution is the evidence just ain't there. And the evidence that is there, in many ways, runs contrary to what the theory says should happen.
So let me. I'm not poking a hole here, but I want us to move to a different topic purely because most of us are not going to get into arguments with PhDs in biology about this.
Right.
And when those of us who don't spend our lives doing this, just as easily as I can go to Answers in Genesis and look up, what they have to say about transitional fossils, someone on the other side can go and PhD dissertations are being written about why their side is right. Mm-hmm. And so they will bring up all of the evidence that is available and make the best argument and on their side. And so you'll have sides going at each other. And I might just be speaking for myself here, but I am not qualified to sift through all of the different levels of information that is required there. So if one side told me that there were transitional fossils and the other side said, well, those don't actually count, then we get into issues of like, what is the burden of evidence? Essentially, we end up trusting experts. And while usually that's not a bad thing, in this case, we might believe that people have ulterior motives. And there are experts on both sides. There's a lot of fallacies we can get into with all of this. But let's move on to some of the other issues that are less about the fossils themselves than they are about how the process happened.
Right.
Irreducible complexity is another one that we can talk about where we're talking about the evolution process, and the one I've always heard here is the eye.
Mm-hmm.
So we are able to see with our eyes. It is an amazing little machine that God created, and for an evolutionary biologist, one of their tasks is coming up with the idea of, all right, how did we go from an amoeba that had some sensory organs to the complexity of the eye, which is far more complex than the amoeba itself that we begin with. And once again, there have been papers published with theories on how that happened. Like, here's the steps that have to be taken. But Jeremy, talk us through, like, why should we doubt? Why should we doubt this idea of when complexity is explained away?
Well, the idea behind irreducible complexity, it's Michael Behe, Behe, is one of the leading proponents, developers of kind of what we're talking about. He uses the illustration of a mousetrap. Okay, just imagine a really simple mousetrap. You got your wood base, you've got, I don't even know what all the parts are called, but you got the thing that the peanut butter, we use peanut butter, but the cheese or whatever sits on. You've got the bar that is designed to trap the mouse. You've got the bar that goes across that holds the little trap piece in place, and you've got the spring. Very, very simple device. Irreducible complexity is the idea that if you take away one piece, you don't get a semi-functional mousetrap. It does not work. It's a system where if you take away just one part, it literally does not function. And again, with Darwinian macroevolution, the idea is that each successive mutation or adaptation makes the organism more survivable, okay? The problem that you have is, under Darwinian macroevolution, new biological systems don't just poof appear, okay? You don't have an amoeba and then you have an amoeba with an eye, okay?
So the idea there, so what a evolutionary biologist would say is that that within any organism there's random mutations. Like, for example, what causes cancer today is a mutation of genes or of cells, and some, so let's say that there's billions and billions of these amoebas. Some of them have mutations that positively benefit them, which goes into the survival of the fittest. But so let me, if I'm understanding correctly, so irreducible complexity would say that, sure, you can, so what are the chances that all of the parts of the eye, that's the one we're going with, let's say that there's 5 parts that you have to have for it to function. You might have one of those pieces mutate randomly over billions, but what are the chances that a mutation that rarely happens mutates in a beneficial way for all 5 of those pieces that are needed in the same generation? Now, so there might be 1,000 parts to the eye, but only 5 of them are needed to come in at one time. Anyway, is that kind of what we're?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Is you have all the pieces in place in the right order at the right time. I read, Lee Strobel's interview with Michael Behe in The Case for Creator. Michael Behe, and I may be butchering his name. If I am, Dr. Behe, I apologize.
I'll send this video to him.
Yeah, in the one-off chance that this actually appears before him, that'd be cool. The example he uses is the system of blood clotting. If the clotting factor isn't perfect, it either doesn't clot fast enough to save the life of the organism, of the human being, or it works too fast and your entire blood system solidifies.
I don't know why I'm smiling.
And think about this: the purpose of a blood clot is to stop up a cut. So it's got to clot. It's got to clot where you're cut. That's a lot of similar sounds. It's got to clot in the right place, but nowhere else. Okay, so if it doesn't do it in the right place, at the right time, in the right way, at the right level, the organism dies. And again, it's not like you can have a half-functional blood clotting system. If one of those factors is off, it's not just that the organism is hampered, the organism is dead. Okay, so there's no way for that to come about by small successive changes, because if you don't have the whole system, you've got a non-functional system. That is not a beneficial adaptation. The natural selection would not select that organism to pass on its genes.
So, okay, if I was an evolutionist, see, this is one of the fun things that evolutionists get to do. Is if they tell you, oh, the universe is 1 billion years old or 100 billion years old, and you introduce these additional complexities, they say, oh, well, did I say 100 billion? It's now 1 trillion years old. Because you need, in order to justify the mathematical complexity of all of the random mutations that would have to occur, and as we're laying out, have to occur at the same time, you need not infinite, but you need extreme numbers of these mutations to happen. Which is why, if you ask scientists how old is the universe, the more you go back in time, the younger they thought it was, and the more we get out, the more they have to expand. Like, oh wow, we didn't realize all of the complexity that's here. We're running up against the 30-minute mark, so I want to cover 2 things, maybe in 5 minutes.
Do our best.
Yeah, we'll do our best. Jeremy, talk us through origins. Like, okay. How does the evolution argument get back to origins? Maybe 2 or 3 minutes there, and then let's talk about theistic evolution.
2 or 3 minutes on origins. This will be fun. This is my favorite. Okay, we've kind of gone in reverse order of my favorites. Okay, the problem of origins / information. Okay, let's assume for the sake of argument that the mutation thing works, okay, that you've got the span of time, all right? And by the way, the general consensus now is 3.5 to 4 billion years for life, 5 billion years for the Earth. I think 13.5 for the universe, billion, is the general naturalistic explanation. So let's assume that it all works. Where does that first cell come from? See, at some point, in whole episodes of famous science fiction shows have been done on the question of what is alive and what isn't. Okay?
Now, are you saying the first living organism, or just like the yelm of the Big Bang?
The first living organism.
Okay.
Where does life come from? Because you think about it, for Darwinian macroevolution to work, you have to have a life form that replicates itself. Where does that come from? And that is, in many ways, just an insurmountable barrier. It's like, I often put this with the problem of information. DNA is a form of an alphabet. It's got human, the genetics, I think there's like four letters for something in there. But the bottom line is DNA is information.
Right.
A single strand of human DNA contains more information than exists in the entire Encyclopedia Britannica. Information is
Wikipedia, though.
Well, either one. And you know, DNA is probably more accurate than Wikipedia. You can't edit it. You can't edit your DNA yourself. We're getting off topic, and you only gave me 3 minutes.
I did.
Okay, so information is not a pattern. Okay. People will often point to the way that nature will self-organize. You flush your toilet, it creates the swirl. Okay. That's a repeating pattern. That's not information. Information is where you put, okay, you're going to write a paragraph. It's not a pattern, but it is recognizable as information because you're constructing the letters in such a way as to create words. You know what the words mean. Information always comes from intelligence. Where does the information in DNA come from? If we received a message, if we received a signal from deep space and it was coming in recognizable Morse code, the world would go bananas. Justifiably so. Because we would not say, oh, look at that, a random Morse code message that says, you know, you humans are crazy, please don't ever contact us. Okay. We would not say, wow, that's amazing. Look at how random that is. Random chance, put that together. We would assume that there were aliens trying to send us a message. Because we know information comes from intelligence. It does not come from a repeating pattern. So where does the information in DNA come from? Where does that first replicating cell come from? How do you get from organic chemicals to a replicating life form? And that's something that we cannot, there has not been a theoretical explanation other than this is what must have happened. The problem is there's not any evidence to back it up that that's what must have happened. And you've still got that problem of where does that information in the DNA come from?
So, okay, so I agree with what you're saying. On the other side, I think what they would, I think what you're saying, the argument that you said that they would make is a powerful one, that's how it must have happened. You can explain a lot of things if you're allowed to say, well, whatever my explanation is, that's how it must have happened.
Which, interestingly enough, means you're getting into an evolution of the gaps argument.
Yes, and it's a faith-based argument that you have to have. Christians obviously would say you have to have more faith in evolution than you have to have to support your beliefs than you have to have in God. It's more plausible. If we're going for the more plausible argument, I think not only do we as Christians believe it, but science backs it up as well. We could talk. We've talked a long time about this. Really quickly, if you're tired of watching the video, turn us off now. All right, really quickly. Let's say we present this video to Christians. They read Lee Strobel's book. They read the evidence. And they still don't believe in the traditional creationist version of how the world happened. There are some within Christianity, perhaps even some within our own congregation, who believe in what's called theistic evolution, that the process of evolution happened, but that, Jeremy, you kind of got a little bit towards us, you did, that God guided this process. So believing in God as the creator, but believing in what they see as the observed evolutionary process, and that God was in charge of it. Now, neither of us believe this. However, we're faced with an interesting dilemma. We're not going to solve that problem tonight. How do we treat these Christians? How do we fellowship with them?
Well, do they believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Do they commit their lives to him? Mm-hmm. Do they live their lives in a way that would please him? Do they, when they fall short, do they fall on his grace? If they do that, then based on what I read in the New Testament, they're our brother or our sister. You still run into the interesting evidentiary challenges of the fossil record and things like that, where you're not seeing those transitional forms. And why did God allow these forms to be fossilized and these forms, and he didn't allow these forms to be fossilized? And it just opens a whole lot of questions. But regardless of that fact, that is still someone who has faith in God. And as you pointed out, there are those that say that you need more faith to believe in evolution than in intelligent design. Well, I mean, having faith in an intelligent designer guiding that process does answer some of the evidentiary questions we've raised. How do you get these irreducibly complex systems? Where does the information come from? What is the origin of life? All of those things are answered by, well, if there's a designer, he could make those things happen. So again, my question would be, do they believe in God, in his Son, in his word? If they do, there are brothers and sisters in Christ, according to the New Testament. And if there is something about their life that would leave them out of the fellowship rather than in the fellowship, that is in the hands of God. That is not in our hands. And if they are willing to say, I disagree with you, if you believe in a literal reading of Genesis 1-11, and they say, yeah, I disagree with you on that, if they're willing to fellowship someone who is Genesis 1-11 is literal, then a literal Genesis 1-11 person should be willing to fellowship them as well.
So I'm going to very quickly agree with what you said. And I think one of the things you hit on at the end is key here. One of the arguments I hear against counting these people as part of the fellowship is that they are not taking the word of God seriously. And so I include myself in the conservative camp here that believes in a literal Genesis 1-11. But I have to take my brother or sister's word for it that they believe that genuinely God was not meaning it to be literal in chapters 1-11. I think that's wrong. And I think as a congregation, obviously all congregations are autonomous, need to do what they see as best, but I would want the leadership of our congregation to say, we fellowship with you, but you can't teach that, that there's some protection of the flock there. Obviously we're open for conversations and those sorts of things, but anyway, I think that's one of the things that the church can expect to deal with in this context of how does evolution and the Christian faith go together. Anyway, thanks for entertaining my weird questions. So we've gone a little long tonight, but we appreciate those of you who have stuck with us through this. We are continuing on with our Apologetics series for a few more weeks. I think we have 6 or 7 more weeks of this, and we will hit on a new topic each week. So we look forward to having a conversation with you next week.
Have a good week.